So I would like to thank very much Discovery for inviting me here today. This is such an honor, and I couldn't believe I was on the same page as the Disney guy, and then meeting the young people today. I'm so humbled and heartened to know that they're here. Our future is safe. But I'm going to tell you about a different future today. I'm going to talk about human space exploration. But first of all, this is where we are today. And it probably has changed a little bit since this picture comes from a RadarSat, an Earth observation satellite that Canada put into space a number of years ago, and I think we got the arrow right. You probably see some changes, but what I'm talking about today is not looking from space down on Earth, but we're going to be looking at from Earth up in space. Now, when you talk about space exploration, I always think that, and people always say, well, why do we have to explore space? Don't ask me. Let's look to experts. Stephen Hawking came up with a very pragmatic view. He said, I don't think the human race will survive the next 1,000 years unless we spread into space. There are too many accidents that can befall life on a single planet. But I'm an optimist. We will reach out to the stars. But you know, that's pretty good, but I will tell you, I think Robert Browning captured it better. He said, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's the heavens for? Oh, and I just forgot 2 disclaimers as I proceed with this talk. I was just at a meeting where everyone offered disclaimers, and disclaimers are when you say things that will lead to bias in what you're saying. First, I'm a scientist. So you're going to be hearing this from a scientist's view. Shout out. Okay. So you're going to hear this from a scientist's view, and I really appreciate that we're a group effort, but you're seeing it through that lens. Second disclaimer, I get choked up. I'm so sentimental. I almost cried when I met the students today. So I might get a little choky at some of these slides, okay? So I apologize. So when we look at humans going into space, the Maple Leaf has even been on Mars, and the Curiosity rover on an instrument that was doing measurements. And our planetary exploration people, they even had the Voyager 2, which was launched in I think the late 70s. It's already left our solar system. And the astronomers, they have looked so far into a galaxy 55 million light years away to see this black hole. But I come back to Browning. My works are nearer heaven, but I sit here. When you think about human exploration of space, how far have we gone? Well, on Apollo 13, in order to get back to Earth, the orbital mechanics meant that they had to go to the dark side of the moon, which is around 400,000 kilometers away from Earth. And that's as far as a human has gone. So you compare that with 55 million light years. We still have a ways to go. And right now, we still look at the stars, we still want to go there. But we have some serious hurdles to overcome. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of those hurdles, what we're doing about it, what Canada's doing about it, and hopefully what you can do about it. So we've gone to the moon, but recently we've been hanging out on the International Space Station, which is 400 kilometers above us. And it does around 16 orbits, I think, of Earth every day. And so there's a sunrise every 90 minutes. And we use that to understand the effects of one of the greatest risks that humans encounter in space, and that's the free fall or the microgravity effects on the human body. Now, I'm a scientist. If you want to know what something does, we're kind of blunt. We take it away and see what happens. So all life, as we know it, evolved with gravity. So when you go into space, in a free fall, take it away. And the fact that we can survive and thrive in that environment is amazing. And I knew an entomologist. He used to tell me there was this one particular beetle that if you put it into microgravity, it would actually explode. We never did that, but I was always curious. But anyway, so we're on the International Space Station. And so as I was saying, microgravity, it's an issue. Now, some of the changes, when you think about it, even as you're seated, even if I'm boring you and you start to slump, you're still fighting gravity to stay in your chair. But in space, there is no gravity, so you don't have to worry about staying upright. And so the legs, you don't use them very much. And for any equipment designers, your equipment has to be kick-proof, because as they float through, they're going to push off it. So the legs, the bones in the legs and in the spine, they start to dissolve because they're not being used. They're not being stressed in any way. And you tend to lose a lot of muscle. And that's not the only effect. Here's what we call a puffy face, and you don't see it, but it's chicken leg syndrome. So David Saint-Jacques, you see him on Earth, and you'll notice that that picture in space, it's not a distortion of the lens. His face is actually kind of puffy, and that's because the fluid shifts up into his face. And again, we don't see his legs. They were probably really, really skinny looking. But one of the ways your body adapts to that is it says, okay, there's just too much blood because you've got all this blood pooling here, so you lose blood volume. And when we say bone dissolves, it doesn't just like go away. As that bone dissolves, that calcium ends up in the bloodstream. And we know that that a lot of different systems shift, and I'm going to show you some data later on that, oh, wait for it, I'm a scientist, got to show you data. And these microgravity effects are quite profound. And also imagine, you go for it, you're in microgravity, your body adapts, well then you have to come back into a 1G environment. And getting there, you have to come back to Earth. And there have been G-forces up to 9G coming back. Now, I once participated in parabolic flight, and I experienced 2G. I had a problem lifting my arm off the armrest, which I was clutching desperately. So you try to imagine 9G. I once heard an astronaut talk about how he felt coming back to Earth. There was a brick attached to his wrist. It was his wristwatch. So those shifts, it's bad enough being in 0G or 1G, but it's the change after you've adapted to one or the other that makes it so astronauts usually need some assistance in leaving the space vessel after a prolonged period in time. And fortunately, we have a lot of people to help them. If you go to the moon or Mars, you might not have that assistance, even though there's still less of a gravity field, you still are going to have some gravity effects. So we have the variable gravity, that's one risk. Another risk is that the nice thing about the International Space Station from an astronaut health point of view is that we still have a lot of the Earth's atmosphere to protect us from a lot of the space radiation. Most of it that we experience comes from our sun. So we have solar particle events that emit a series of heavy ions, molecules that can come out and be quite damaging. It also gives us the northern lights, but for human systems, not so good. And there are all the suns throughout the universe, and they're also doing this kind of activity, so we have that baseline galactic cosmic rays, so that low level that comes in. So we still haven't really conquered space radiation, and we know that it affects the eyesight, it affects you can get radiation-induced cataracts. We know that if you're during a solar flare, you can actually have what we call a catastrophic radiation event. We know that, hey, we use radiation to induce mutagenesis in life science experiments, so we know that there's increased mutation rates. So as we go outside of Earth's atmosphere, we're going to be exposed to more radiation. And the radiation isn't just directly affecting us, but something like, I don't know, 15 to 30% of the satellites orbiting Earth no longer function because of radiation damage. So radiation can damage the instruments that keep us alive in space. So it's really important to have that kind of thing. And I know this one radiation expert who always says, look at your smartphone. All that stuff compressed into one nice tiny little space. One molecule is going to take the whole thing out. So those big clunky computers, when everything is well spaced, they're actually more radiation resistant. So we're looking for radiation resistant materials. And space is the small, like astronauts are the small market, satellite developers, they're the big market. So radiation is another effect. And then you're in space, It's actually the isolation. You're far from home, and you're alone. And now imagine going camping, you get to the cabin, and you're not with your friends and family, you're with 3 of the guys you work with. So depending on your work environment, maybe that's a good thing. And depending on your family, maybe that's a good thing. But that's a little bit different, and they come from different cultures. They have different habits. So it's different, and you're far away, so you know that life is going on without you. And one astronaut, whose name eludes me at this moment, famously said, you're isolated in space, and then you come back to a life that has evolved without you, and you want to integrate yourself back into a family. So that's not easy. And now they say that space is infinite. The inside of space vessels is definitely not. So this is David St. Jacques on his launch in a Soyuz, a Russian Soyuz. Now, getting to space station in a Soyuz, and again, that's looking through the hatch, okay? So you can be there for 6 hours to 3 days. That's where you are. And now the International Space Station is relatively spacious by comparison, but I have to say, it all kind of looks like that. So you're still confined in that kind of space. If somebody irritates you, you can float to another module that looks like that. And I saw there is a certain effect with that, plus everything you take, it's there. So what are we doing now? The International Space Station really matters a lot to us because it's the longest ranked human platform. So if we want to know what's going to happen on a mission to Mars, where you know you're going to be in transit for either 6 months up to 2 years, depending on which orbit you take, well, we have Canadian scientists that we don't do in-house, we outsource, so we invite Canadian scientists to compete to do science to help us understand the effects of space on the human body, or on humans. So these are several different experiments. Our website describes them very well, but I'm going to talk about Biomonitor, which is actually a technology, because if we want to know, we often do what we call pre-post. We have to know what happens before they go into space, and we see what happens afterwards. But we don't know if changes happen really fast or really slow. And if you take blood samples, you have to freeze them and hope that they're going to bring them back at some time. But we know that samples degrade. And if we want to take measures, that can be kind of tricky in space. But Biomonitor is made by Keynote Technologies, and it's a shirt, a t-shirt that takes a whole bunch of physiological measures, blood pressure, heart rate, all these kinds of things that really help us to understand some of the changes. So as researchers are really, really interested, and maybe eventually, once we make sure it works well, the clinicians might actually use it for diagnostics. Another important experiment is wayfinding. So if you close your eyes, you can touch your nose. Why? It's because you have gravity-dependent receptors at the end of your muscles and nerves that tell you when your eyes are closed where your limbs are in space. So that classic drunk test, most astronauts would probably fail because in free fall, those gravity receptors aren't going to work. And so not only do those things not work, your vestibular system, all those little crystals in your ear that tell you which is up, which is down, they're floating, so they don't work. You have to use your eyesight. So Wayfind is an experiment that looks at how do you navigate through space when you don't have your gravity vector, which we don't even realize is our way to navigate. And we have our first psychosocial experiment we're doing in space called At Home in Space, and it looks at how when you're with your 3 buddies who you work with, isolated, how do you develop a culture of your own? And I've seen astronauts come back, it's really funny, some of them are like very professional, yes, yes, yes. And I remember there were these 2, it was a Russian American, they'd been up in space for quite a while. They were like a married couple. They were hysterical. And I still remember that one of them was going to tell a story, and he's going, no, you tell it. And he's like, no, you tell. And it was so funny. But you realize these guys genuinely liked each other. They came back like brothers. And that's not always the case, but we want them to feel like brothers in space. We want that experience for them. So how can we promote that? So this is like At Home in Space might help us to understand that. Data. Now this data came from Richard Hewson, and he's at the University of Waterloo, and you can be rightly proud. He's probably the leading world physiologist, space effects on the cardiovascular system. Now, what you see on your left, each point represents the elasticity of the carotid artery of a specific astronaut, okay? They're male and female astronauts. You see it decreases because their carotid artery stiffens in space. That was a pre-post measure after just 6 months in space. Now, those gradual gentle bars you see on the right, that's what you see in a Caucasian population that ages between 50 and 80 years old. So what you see in some astronauts, their carotid arteries stiffen as much in 6 months as you see in 20 years of aging. Nobody expected that. Well, Richard hypothesized that there might be some shifts, and he found them. And so he actually uncovered a risk we didn't even know about. So here's an adaptation. So stay tuned. He's now looking to see if we actually see a rehabilitation. Do they get the elasticity back when they return to Earth? Long term. So we can learn some very interesting things. But you saw that some of these changes we see are similar to what you see in aging. Bone loss, muscle loss. But with our astronauts, when they come back to Earth, they rehabilitate. They can do exercises and get stronger. Well, will that apply to an aging population? So this is what we think of. Sometimes we think of some of the qualities of aging. It's not identical, but it resembles a little bit accelerated aging. And are we seeing accelerated rehabilitation? And can that help us understand aging? This is my mom with my dog. And there was another aspect to aging that I thought, I didn't expect this one. But I realized, and this is where some of the young entrepreneurs really spoke to me, it's because my mom in Saskatoon would not leave home over the winter. She wouldn't go to get her medication. She wouldn't go to get her warfarin test because it was too dangerous. And I thought, that's just like an astronaut. They can't get all their blood tested. They can't go see the doctor. They can't go get the groceries. And so I could see that with an aging population, I saw that similarity. And the other similarity I saw was that I became a dog carrier. So I'd go visit my mom, bring the dog. She didn't really care about me. She wanted to see the dog, but she wanted something to hold and to give comfort. And that wasn't a workmate. And that dog supplied that. And that sort of told me something else about what we could offer our astronauts. Something that's novel and fun, not judgmental, really cute. And so this is just another aspect to relieve sort of loneliness. And you don't think about it in space, you can get lonely, but when it's always the same people, you can. And in the same isolation we see with an aging population, we see in our northern communities. So when we think of healthcare delivery, when we think about having some changes and just stopping, like, you sort of get in a routine and how you can change that, again. And also, just again with my mom, she couldn't get to the grocery store all the time. She wouldn't go, and we were worried about her diet. Well, in the north, we know that food supply is really important, and it's very expensive, and they have very, very limited food stuff. So can some of our solutions that we're starting to look at in space help us on Earth? And the opposite. Can what we learn in Earth help us in space? So I hope you're starting to see how I'm trying to bring the space and the Earth, so when you work in space, it helps us on Earth. And also, for all the entrepreneurs out there, don't use space as your sole model. That's guaranteed road to ruin. You have to have a terrestrial model because we're the icing on the cake. We can open doors for you, but if you have a sustained business model, it's going to be on a terrestrial need. You only need a couple of robotic arms. You don't need 5,000 of them all the time, right? So the robotic arm, that same technology has been adapted for the same precision that can grab a space vessel and bring it into the space station is now being used to better target tumors for surgery. And this reduces recovery time, makes for safer surgery. So that's, and there's another, if you go to the WOW zone, Calm Technologies, they flew bone tissue culture apparatus on the space station, the space shuttle, and also on a Russian Bion. And we funded them at one point. NASA funded them to adopt their technology to the International Space Station. And what they learned about interoperability, they translated into the coolest thing called Swidget. So check them out. And so they're from Kingston. So this is, again, they had a space model, but they also built a terrestrial model. So you need them both. And now, if you talk to astronauts, one of the most moving things that they describe is looking at Earth as one in space. And that changes their spirit. They become really, really affected by that so that they want to preserve Earth. They see us all as one. They don't see borders. They often talk about that. When you're on Mars and you look up at the sky, this was taken from a Spirit rover. Earth's just going to be another star. What is that going to do to how we see ourselves? So there's going to be some real changes as we explore space, both to our psyche, to our technology, to how we view ourselves. And again, the challenges depends where you go. The farther away you are from Earth, the harder it's going to be. The longer the supply chain, if you don't bring it with you, then you don't have it. So this can be an issue. And the minutes they talk about is, I noticed this, that there's a slight delay when I move my arm and when you see it move on the screen. Well, if you go to the moon, that time delay will be 2.6 seconds, communications. If you go to the Mars, it's going to be 40 minutes. So imagine if you go, Houston, I have a problem. And 40 minutes later, they know it. And then they say, we hear you, what is it? 40 minutes later. So this is something that we have to really think about. It's not trivial, but these are the kind of issues. So even the most trivial things, like they become really important when you're going into space. So, it's time we face reality, my friends. We're not exactly rocket scientists. And guess what? You don't have to be a rocket scientist. For human exploration of Mars, or the moon, or space in general, we need the rocket scientists. We need the life scientists. We need food technologists. We need the engineers. We need the businessmen, because we can't do it alone. And space is quite unique in that it's the only time that I'm ever on a stage with an astrophysicist, a businessman, an engineer. We never even go to the same meetings. And suddenly we're all at the same meeting. Space requires all these skills and brings us all together. So, oops. And like I said, everything is really difficult in space. So this is Charles Duke. Now watch him. Oh, he drops a hammer.
That's all right.
Who would have thought? Now watch him try to pick it up in his spacesuit. Nope, not going to work. And we still don't have it. Okay, so you see what we needed when they designed that spacesuit, to be fair, they thought about we need to have the oxygen, we need to have the air, we need some heating, we need possibly cooling, but I think it was just heating in this case. So they need all these things, but they didn't think about we need good dexterity, we need good mobility. He ended up going back to the lander to get tongs that he repurposed from picking up rocks to picking up the hammer, so it's still not, it's gone. But so this is why even something like that, we need the engineers to talk to the physiologists, talk to kinesiologists, to talk to everyone so that we can actually figure out what's going on up there. So we need the whole family. So this is an artist's rendition of the Deep Space Gateway. So it's a orbiting platform around the moon. I'm terrible at orbital mechanics, don't ask me. But what I understand is you take smaller loads to Deep Space Gateway, you can assemble them there, and then they can go, so it's a waypoint to go to the moon, to go to Mars, to go wherever you want to go. And it's easier to take little things to one place and assemble big than to just launch big, honky things. And that's also going to be a human platform. So this is an image. You see the stars and stripes? We need to have the maple leaf there. And so I'm asking you, we need your help. So we would like you to work with us. We're going to have, if you're not on our website, get on our website, get on mailing lists so you hear about opportunities. And we spur innovation because what works on Earth doesn't always work in space. So it forces you to look at problems in a new way. And I think that new way can spark a new kind of innovation. So I choke up on this. So this last slide is a poem that was written by a Japanese astronaut on the International Space Station. So I'll give you 30 seconds to read it. So I ask you to work with us to crack those mysteries and realize our dreams. So thank you very much.